So this is an extra video that I wasn't planning on putting out this week, but one of my good friends online and fellow game dev creator M. Strange started a new podcast called Game Grit Podcast, and it's all about interviewing small-time indie developers and talking shop about the games industry, your personal projects, your pitfalls and strengths, and just the concept of making games in general. So this is the 4th episode that I've appended onto after this introduction. You can go check the link in the description if you want to check out the other episodes. They'll be coming out pretty regularly. I think they're all really interesting to listen to. I think mine in particular was really well done. If you want some more insight on Azumi and the Vertical Slice, how it was made, and just kind of me and his thoughts on game development, I think it's an interesting listen. So I will shut up and let you get to the podcast. Be the games you want to see.
Okay, we're here with Game Dev Grit Podcast, episode 4, and our guest today is Tom Oliver. So Tom, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a newbie game dev. I've been doing game development now for a couple months. Before that, I was doing a lot of like 3D animation, 2D illustration, and I just kind of jump around in mediums all the time. So game dev is one of the things I've wanted to do ever since I was a little kid, and I finally decided, screw it. It's time to be a real boy and get it done. So right now I'm working on a 2D side scroller called the demo is called Azumi and the Vertical Slice. It's like a little bit of a joke, but the full game is unnamed, but it's going to be like a throwback Sega Genesis style platformer, and it's done in an engine called Construct 3, which is all web-based and doesn't require any coding, so it's a good way to kind of quickly jump into making games. But I'm also learning Python right now to get coding chops down, so hopefully the next game will be done in a big boy game engine.
Yeah, and we'll post that game in the show notes so you guys can all go play it. And I think there's one thing we should mention is that we come from similar backgrounds and that we both worked in other mediums, but we were always influenced by video games, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Video games are definitely my number one influence just throughout life. You know, before I started making art, all I was doing was playing video games almost exclusively, so it kind of was inevitable that was the one thing I draw on more than anything else.
Yeah, so our perspective would be like a designer dev, like we're the art first, right? Would you say that? We're the art story first?
Definitely. I mean, the whole thing is that like if I had to only do one thing, it would be something with visual art just because I'm so passionate about it. But I'm such a control freak, and like I love the power of being able to do the whole thing and just throw something down and be like, I did everything in this, that I want to work with a team someday. I think it would be way less stressful. But I'm just like such a taskmaster. Like anybody deviates a little bit from my vision, I'd like get pissed off. So right now I'm still a one-man show.
Yeah, I'm the same way. So far, I think all the guests we've had so far are designers first, and then, having to learn the programming and all the other stuff. So I know we're going to have a guest, Ash Blue, who's an awesome programmer, software developer, so that we're going to get the programmer to designer perspective from him. But so we're probably coming in like a lot of people who have always wanted to do games, but we thought it was like we could never do it because the learning curve was too steep with the programming and stuff like that, right? That's how I was. Would you say you were in a similar?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I first started wanting to make games back in 2004, 2005-ish, with the rise of Newgrounds and everything, and I played Madness and like, dude, someone just made a game, some random guy, this isn't made by like a company, it's just on the internet, and that blew my mind. So I always wanted to do it, and I like bought a book on BASIC and started reading through that, and it was just like way over my head, and I always had self-esteem issues, so I would just like poo-poo myself, like I'm too dumb, I can't do it. So I kind of just let that go and started doing like more art things because that was kind of more my speed at the time. But the reason I actually started doing this game is because last November was my birthday when I turned 30. And I was like, I can't leave my 20s behind without doing something. And so I always wanted to make a game. So I was like, screw it, it's happening. Before I turn 30, I will have a playable product of some sort out because it's something I've always wanted to do. So for all of October, I did what's called Devtober. And I didn't even know I was doing it until halfway through. Someone told me it was a thing. I'm like, oh, I guess I'm doing it. I made a vlog on one of my YouTube channels every month documenting putting this little demo of a game together. So like, you can go on my channel and watch the entire pretty much production of it from start to finish, going from just like a basic character that can jump to like a fully fleshed out product.
And I must say, I was super impressed with it as your first thing. That's why I told you personally. I was like, dude, you're natural. So
thank you.
Tell us, okay, let's get into the grit now. So the design, the art, that kind of stuff, that's kind of in our blood, right? That's like, okay, we know how to do that. So
Definitely.
what's the thing in game development so far that's been like, oh God, it's really difficult, or the thing that's giving you the headaches or twisting your mind up?
I think the thing that is the most difficult for me in terms of game design so far, even just with because to clarify my kind of journey so far, is I started in an engine called Godot, which is like a free open source game engine that's relatively new. It's a couple years old now, but has a big kind of like cult following. You know how like all these free open source things always have a
Mhm.
huge like fervent, dedicated, zealous fan base online. Uh, so I was starting with that, and I started doing the coding language they have called GD script, which is based on Python. And I started building the Azumi game in that for a while. And I was just running into so many roadblocks because the documentation for the engine, because it's so new, is really bad. It just kind of assumes you know Python or something already. It just says it's like Python except X. That was kind of the documentation process for Godot as it stands right now. So I was just totally lost. And I just decided to switch to something that was code free. And while that made it a lot easier, the thing that I have the most difficult with right now is just that computers are stupid. And it's very difficult for me to kind of sometimes tell the program what I want it to do. A lot of the times I'll just make assumptions, like, because I'll think about code like a human and I'm not thinking about it like a computer. You know, like computers are super literal. So a lot of the times I'll like make something that like in English makes sense. Like if you look at like the actions, the events of the code, like if you're just reading it like English, like yeah, of course, but I'm making like English assumptions. So the computer needs to specifically be told like only do this once. Where like if you just looked at it, you'd naturally just assume this has to be done once. But if you don't put that condition in, it just kind of like loops the timer indefinitely because like the condition's always true. So the timer's just going to restart infinitely. And for an hour, I'll be like, why is this not working? And they're like, oh, the computer's dumb and I'm not thinking like a computer, I'm thinking like a human. And so that's the thing that's constantly tripping me up. It's just like I have to kind of like step back and be like, okay, I got to think about how programming actually works, not like how a human would interpret what I'm trying to do.
You got to start counting from zero and thinking like a computer. So
Exactly.
there's two resources. I think there's two or three books with a similar name, but really helped me in this way. Exactly as you're saying. It's called How to Think Like a Programmer.
Ooh.
And there's more than one, but I think both of them are good. But they just kind of what they do in those books is just like, hey, look, programming isn't about numbers. It's not about syntax and all this stuff. It's about problem solving. So what you need to do is just look at what you're trying to do and break it down into the problems you're trying to solve, and then you figure out like what goes into your code and what needs to come out. And I just found it really, really helpful to think like a computer or think like a programmer. So if anybody's struggling with that, check those.
Yeah,
How to think like a programmer.
there's another book I started reading and I haven't delved too deeply into it, but I just read like the introductory chapter and it was really interesting. It was, I think it's called like the C Sharp Yellow book. It's like a free download you can get. It's like
Yeah.
an introduction to C Sharp. And the whole first kind of chapter is just talking about like how to make programs and how to think programs through. And he's talking about how like the first thing you should do before you make any program is document everything that you need it to do in English. So when you go in to start coding, you don't just start typing, you just know like all the little small systems you need to work. So you can put those together and then put the entire application together out of those pieces that you've already kind of fleshed out in real language. It was an interesting way of thinking about it. It's kind of helped me put together the game I'm working on now. Because right now, the vertical slice is done. The reaction to it on Newgrounds stuff has been really good. So I want to go and make a full game, but I want to go back to the code that I have right now and optimize it, make everything kind of like modular. So like things I'll be reusing are like in functions and things like that. So it just works better. And I want to sit down and actually do that and just write out everything I need to make just in English first. So I know all the systems I have to put together as opposed to just kind of doing a mad dash over the course of 30 days trying to get it out.
Yeah, and I don't remember if it was in the book Clean Code or The Pragmatic Programmer, but where they talk about like creating your code not just for you to understand, but other people, but also you in the future. Because what I found, what happens, and they hammer on naming conventions for variables, for methods, for everything, so that when you read a method or a variable, you know what it is and what it does. Right. So it's
Right.
about super descriptive names and like making them, it doesn't matter if they're long as long as they're descriptive, because what happened to me is that I'll write some code, everything works, it's logical, but maybe I didn't do the naming conventions, the way I was supposed to. And then 6 months later, I look at that code and I have no idea how it works.
Right.
So It's
There's
about
actually I'm running into a similar problem with the engine I'm using right now because Construct's great, but there's a lot of limitations to it because it's kind of designed for like introduction to like how computer science and stuff works. And one of the things that they just released today that they didn't have before today was comments for individual actions. So I couldn't comment anything in the game that I've done so far. They just added like full featured comments today in an update. So I got to go back through all of my code and finally be able to add comments so I'll remember how everything works.
maybe though, Tom, because in the super geeky software engineering, like in clean code, they say that you should write your code so that it doesn't need comments because
Next
through the
level.
naming and through the order of the methods, like they say that the methods from top down, your code should be a story, like get this target, check distance from target. So you can read it so you don't need comments. Sometimes you need them, of course, but it's just kind of getting in the philosophy. So like, hey, I'm going to make my code make sense through the code itself.
That's pretty interesting because everybody I've talked to about code has always been like, if you don't comment, you're a little bitch and a little bitch and a little bitch. And I'm like, all right.
So I'm still pretty new, but from my perspective, that's kind of like an advanced novice thing. Yes, like novice just writes sloppy code, doesn't comment anything, the naming is terrible. And then kind of the advanced novice is like writing sloppy code, but then they comment everything. And then maybe the more advanced is like, I just write clean code that doesn't need comments.
Dude, the clean code sounds like a code samurai. You don't need comments. You're just fucking zen on that shit. It sounds
When
awesome.
you start doing it, it's like it makes so much sense, and it's just a little extra time. It's just laziness, really, that we don't do it because, when you're going through the code and you're like, I'm new to programming, so I'm excited when things work. I don't know if you're the same. Like there's
Oh,
an excitement,
absolutely.
so I'm so excited just to move forward. I don't want to take an extra 30 seconds to name the method or the variable, but man, you don't have to do it at the time too.
Yeah.
There's this whole thing called refactoring. There's whole books you can get on it, but it's all about like, okay, you did your sloppy code, it works. Now let's refactor it. Let's go back through it, make it make sense, clean it up, all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
So another thing I want to ask you, because this is something that happened to me, because I started using visual scripting or non-programming techniques, and I want to ask if you hit this wall yet. And everything was great, until I wanted to start to do more advanced stuff, and then I found that the pre-made actions and the things didn't do what I wanted it to do.
Yeah, I'm starting to run up against that wall right now. Because one of the things that's a huge problem with Construct as an engine, as much as I love it, and I recommend it wholeheartedly to people who want to get into games and they're like scared of it, is that it has functions, but they don't really work like actual functions. Because the way Construct works is it has what's called event sheets. So you have triggers and then responses. So you have a list of like triggers, and then you can add, what those triggers cause to happen in the game. And they have a function thing where the function is the trigger, and then you can put responses in there and call that trigger whenever you want. But because certain triggers can only be self-contained, like you can't just take a whole block of code and put it into a function. It all has to be from one trigger. So the functions are really gimped, and you have to kind of do some crazy workarounds to make functions actually function, for lack of a better word. So that's a huge problem because it means there's a lot of redundancies in your events and stuff because you can't just put everything into a function. And the more I learn about actual programming, doing Python and stuff, the more I'm just like, this is like super baby mode. Like, like I'm already thinking more like a programmer, like beyond what this engine probably really intended from the beginning. Another thing I want to do that I don't know if this engine is going to allow me to do is I want to have a dynamic scarf for Azumi. She's like this little raccoon character, and she's a ninja. She has this big red scarf because I've ripped off the PS2 Shinobi. It's one of my favorite games ever. And I want to have like a scarf that kind of follows you around and like flows with you as you jump around and stuff and make it look cool. And I don't know if I can do that in this engine because I wouldn't even know where to start. And that might be the one reason that I'll start coding more is because I want a dynamic scarf.
Yeah, the wall you hit, because what happened to me, I started using Playmaker, which is excellent. I still use it for my high level design for managing states, like finite state machines, FSMs. That's what they were designed for. But I would hit these walls where I couldn't find the actions because Playmaker uses these things called actions. That's like their little modular blocks that you piece together as a non-programmer to make things work.
Mm-hmm.
And the actions that I wanted didn't exist, so I found myself waiting on developers. So then posting threads like, hey, can someone make this, to the people that develop Playmaker or some other people that are making the actions. And so I found myself waiting around, for something I wanted to do. And then I got into making my own actions. And then once you get into that, it forces you to start coding. And then I was like, well, why don't I just code everything, you know? And then,
Exactly.
but then
That's
I
what's
was
pretty
like,
sweet about Playmaker is that it can interact with, native C# and Unity, because like Construct has no coding ability at all. I kind of wish I had used Stencil. It's another kind of code-free thing, but you can code in hacks in it on top if you want to do custom actions. So there's more flexibility there, but I didn't know that at the time.
it,
Which is kind of a bummer, but
let
I'm
me
going to be a real programmer anyway. It's going to be fine. It's all going to be good.
let me share some of my journey. And so when I started, I went into 3D because I came from 3D animation. So I was like, oh, yeah, I know 3D. Let me go into 3D, right? Wrong.
Yeah.
I should have started with 2D because so it's good, I think, that you're starting with 2D because there's so much stuff that's so complicated that has nothing to do with the medium at all, like whether it's 2D or 3D. But then when you throw in 3D in that third dimension, it makes everything so much more complicated and difficult. So if anybody's starting out, I say go 2D first and like make a bunch of games in that and just get down how do triggers work? How does the basic 2D physics work before you try to go 3D physics? And I mean, everything else that comes along with game design.
So here's a question. I have a question for you because I'm curious about it. Because like we've been talking back and forth a little bit about my Unity versus Godot debacle, of which engine I'm going to eventually go with. A bunch of people are telling me that like the 2D in Unity is like a nightmare to work with. Would you say that's true, or is that overblown?
So I've only done fake 2D. So I did a game, not Flip and Chop. I did one called Smashy Town. It was fake 2D. So I used 3D characters in a 2D plane.
Gotcha.
So I used the 2D mode. So I haven't had any experience using the pure 2D.
Gotcha.
So yeah, doing the fake. It was hacky, but it worked. It's just because I had.
I
the
mean,
experience
as long
with
as it
3D,
works.
So, yeah, I'd have to find someone that does 2D and Unity and try to get them on here. But I mean, a lot of my favorite games that are 2D, like Nuclear Throne was Game Maker. You know, a lot of the games I liked that weren't, 2D weren't made in Unity. So
right.
yeah, I don't know. But so let me ask you about your current Azumi project. Is it 2D or 3D or 3D
It
2D
is.
or something?
It is a 2D game because it constructs a 2D engine. But all the characters are all based on 3D models, and I'm exporting PNGs, and then I'm indexing the colors in like Photoshop, so they just compress down. Like I think because I'm trying to model it after a Sega Genesis game because that was my first console, and I will die before I give up my Sega. So the Sega, from what I read, can support up to 15 colors and transparency on a sprite. So I based the limited palettes for all the 3D model exports around that. So when you compress them down, they look like Sega sprites. And then I put those into the engine. So all the characters in the game are 3D models, but they're just obviously exported to be working in a 2D engine. So it gives you a lot of flexibility with like animation and stuff. Because like if a frame doesn't look right, it's easy to go back in and quickly change it. Which is helpful just because I'm not a great 2D animator, but with 3D, I find 3D animation to be a bit easier, just in terms of like my ability to visualize things. Plus, it's easier to find references because like with 2D references, you have to make sure the you get like a guy swinging a sword, right? You search Google for that. And if it's not the exact right angle you want to draw it from as a reference, it's not 100% great. But with 3D, it doesn't matter what the angle is. You can rotate the model once you've used your reference and have it line up exactly the way you want. So, plus the great thing about doing Sega Genesis kind of sprites is that like 3 or 4 frames of animation is like on point and it saves some time. And you can kind of, fudge things if you're not a great animator like I am. Whereas if I was doing something like Ori and the Blind Forest, I'd be doomed because it would mean you need god tier animation to make it look right.
Yeah, I think I should go back. On my current project, I am doing the menus and some of the UI stuff using pixel art and pixel art animations. And I would just say that there is kind of the workflow as far as like importing sprite animations and then converting them to like animatable objects is kind of clunky without any third-party tools, but there are free third-party tools that like streamline that process. So yeah, I'm using pixel art animations in my current game, and it's pretty smooth if you use those free tools or just like GitHub tools,
Yeah, all the tile sets and the backgrounds were all done in 2D. It was just the characters in the game that are 3D. So I'm kind of mashing both things together.
But you should just do a weekend project in Unity 2D. Just make like a guy run around or something just to see what it's like.
Yeah, there's actually a game because I was talking with some friends because I have a whole Discord server called I Am Games based around my YouTube channel and stuff. We were talking about doing a game jam. There's a game I wanted to do called Ninja Suffering where it's just endless platforms. It's a ninja. You have like a stamina bar that doesn't regenerate, and it just eventually you're gonna die, and you just have to keep jumping from platform to platform, see how far you can get. That'd be a good project to try out for that, maybe.
Yeah, early on when I first started using Unity, I think I did a couple game jams, and that really is a good thing just to force you to ship something, get
Definitely.
through it and not like dawdle on it and try to make it perfect while also learning. I think it's a great way to learn to do little game jam projects, week-long projects or something.
Yeah, my big issue, I don't even say it's an issue, but just like an issue I'm putting on myself is that I'm trying to work on the full game of Azumi, learn more 3D because I'm everything's based on 3D. I'm trying to learn like proper topology and stuff. And I'm trying to learn like actual programming. So I'm splitting my weeks up into like 2 day sprints of like jumping through each of these things. And it's like, oh, it's a lot to do. But it all comes down to serving the big end goal is like I want to make a big 3D PlayStation 2 style action adventure game with Azumi. That was like the game I envisioned when I created the character, but I'm working my way up there slowly.
It's a that's kind of what I'm making right now, my God Machine game. It's a giant 3D platformer RPG, blah blah blah. It's tough, man. That's why I made this podcast because it's so hard. I was like, I want to talk to other people and see what they're doing. So I'm gonna
Yep.
find answer to these questions. And a lot of it, let me ask you this. How are you doing like your level planning, your level layout? How are you writing out the events that happen in your game? Like fight this guy, get this item. Are you drawing maps? How do you plan to do that, or how have you been doing that?
So I'm really super anal about pre-production. Like my problem with a lot of the stuff I've done because I've been trying to like finish projects for years and I always stall out. And it's because I get lost in pre-production. I have a whole Google Drive folder of like 10 years worth of design documents for projects and comics and animations and everything. So when it came to this project, I had a month to get it done, so I couldn't lull in that too long, but everything was documented. I had tons of different like drawn designs for how I wanted the map to work. It was kind of ended up being kind of like a funnel. There's like a safe zone right at the bottom in the middle of the space where none of the enemies spawn, but everything else you can potentially get hit. I had like a checklist of all the things I wanted to get it done in the game, going from like essential to optimal to like optional, and I kind of ranked all those. Have you ever heard of what's it called? Scrum. I read a book on Scrum, which is kind of like a
Agile
like
software development thing?
yeah, it's like agile. So they
Yeah.
talk about like instead of trying to say how much time each task is going to take, weight everything using like the Fibonacci sequence because like easier to tell those like difficulty rankings apart. Like ran like 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, whatever. So I would assign a number ranking to each of these problems. And I would say I need to get like 10 points done a week, and then I'd brush out my whiteboard and every day like this many points today, this many points today. And so every day I would just like wake up knowing exactly what I need to do and just like bust my ass to get it done. And I went over a couple days, but it most of it got done in that 30
Yeah,
day
can you
sprint.
talk more about that? Because just today I was like, because I have a friend who worked for Atlassian or one of these companies, and he managed some project had to do with Scrum, and he was showing it to me for managing other projects. And just today I was like, man, I should probably check out using Scrum for game
Yeah.
development. So how
Scrum.
are you using it?
Yeah. So I mean, I would be lying if I said I adopted Scrum 100% because it was a very small scale project. And the book that I read, Scrum was initially designed for teams. So a lot of the things that Scrum talks about is like you have a bunch of people come together and like the consensus is where like waiting for difficulty and stuff comes from because you kind of assess how your team is comfortable with all these things. So it's kind of difficult, at least from that book, for me to translate into a solo operation. But it was just about segmenting everything that I needed to get done for the game. Because from the very beginning, I knew that I didn't know anything about level design yet. I hadn't read anything good on that. And I was trying to think about like what makes a level fun. Because just because the way I play video games personally, like I don't really ever think much about the levels. I'm much more interested in mechanics in games. So like I have tons of videos of me talking about like the combat in Dark Souls 1 is like 5 milliseconds too slow and it feels like you're wading through molasses. Like those are the things that like I'm anal about. But the level design stuff is always an afterthought to me. So when it comes down to like making a level, I was like, I don't know enough how to do this yet. So I'm just going to do a little arena for the demo so I don't have to think about that too much. Um, so once I had the scope planned out, it was just all the little things. I would just write it all out. I wanted to make sure everything was on paper and I knew what the game needed. I knew Izumi needed some aerial combat, needed a projectile, needed a 3-hit combo on the ground. It had to have running. There were some things I ended up cutting. Like there's a crouch state in the demo, but it doesn't do anything because by the end of the thing, I was like, I'm not going to use this for anything anyways. So it's just kind of, for me, it's about not worrying about time. I think that's like the big takeaway from Scrum, is that it's about assessing difficulty. And there's a concept called a minimum deliverable product. I think someone actually mentioned that on a previous podcast, because that's from Scrum, where it's about identifying how difficult all the elements of your project are going to be, and then figuring out what are the most essential, and you do that first. Because the idea from Scrum is that like it's a response to the waterfall method of designing software and things like that, where you kind of like plan everything out by dates. That was kind of like the general consensus before Scrum came around. And you'd plan out like an entire year or 2 years or 5 years of time. And that was great. It looked great on paper. But if you slip in the beginning, your entire 5-year structure completely falls apart. You know, because then the next one will take longer. That'll push everything back. And then your whole big plan is ruined. So Scrum was designed not to use time, because the guy was saying like people are terrible at estimating time. We always do it incorrectly. So instead, look at difficulty, like how difficult is this task going to be? And then the team would usually come together and decide what's the minimum viable product that we need to deliver to our customers. And then based on feedback from them, what they like and what they don't like, we can begin to tweak and adjust and figure out what needs to be added, what needs to be removed, and what needs to continually to be focused on. So it's kind of about putting the essentials together first and then getting rapid response from whoever's going to be using it. So in our case, you know, we'd probably, in this Discord group is a great example, you would maybe have a small vertical slice or a prototype with just the bare essentials of like your project, and be like, okay, how do people feel about this? And then you can instantly change them if things are janky or not feeling right. So you can adjust those immediately, as opposed to having a 10-year plan or whatever, having this broken combat system, and then 10 years later when you finally ship the thing, you realize, oh, the combat's completely messed up.
What was the name of the book that you read on Scrum?
I believe it was just Scrum. It was by the guy who made the system, but there are definitely other. That. Dude, it's pretty sick.
So let me give you this example. So what I've been using for like my daily, what do I need to do today? And I'm going to tell you why I think it's broken and how this can fix it. I use Hack and Plan. So it's like this Trello alternative that's made just for game development. And it just has tasks, but it's like what you need to do, what's in progress, what's finished, right? Mm-hmm. So, but there is no way, like you were talking about the weighting, to weight the tasks. So all the tasks are equal. So let's just say I have 3 tasks, right? And I'm working on this task for 3 days. And in my head, oh, this is a single task. It shouldn't take this long, right? And It feels like it's weighing me down in my project. But if it had a weight, right? If I knew it was like all these points, then I'd be like, it's fine because this thing's like 50 points or whatever.
Exactly. I mean, one of the big concepts of Scrum that I didn't really do so much because I knew I had 30 days to do it. But if you're doing a longer term project, this is great. It's a concept called sprints. So a sprint in Scrum is usually 1 to 2 weeks, and you'd assign all those points. You'd have all your difficulty things. You choose the optimal things to work on, and then everybody goes off and does their shit. And then 2 weeks later, everybody comes back, and you basically reflect on the work done. So like, let's say we're going to get 50 points done in 2 weeks. If we only get 30 points done, it's like, well, okay, now we know for the next sprint, we got to shoot for 30 points because 50 is way too much. We're going to screw ourselves over if we shoot for 50 again. So it lets you quickly adjust your workload and figure out, okay, this is how much I can get done in this amount of time. So weighting was a huge, big thing for me, because when I had my weekly and daily weights, I would know that like I can afford to spend an entire day on this one thing, and I'll still have time to get everything else done. Whereas if I just kind of guessed, because like a lot of the things that I thought would be simple ended up not being so simple, and vice versa. You know, bugs can like completely screw you over when you expect something to be really simple. But again, for me, I'm not thinking like a programmer. I'm thinking like, you know, an artist. So something that I think is simple is actually going to take way longer. So by being able to quickly reflect on those things, it helps kind of you iterate quicker and you work better in the long run that way.
If you still have it, you think you could take a screenshot of like just your list with some weights on some tasks when we post in the show notes?
I can dig for it. I just moved out of where I was when I was working on the game, so it's somewhere in a box. But if I find it, I will
Okay.
definitely let you know.
Because for me, a lot of times, to see these things, like what people are actually doing, like their tasks and how they, notate them or whatever, is really helpful. Because you read about the stuff and it's like, but wait, how does it actually, how are you executing it? So
Yeah, I mean everything I do is usually on paper. I'm really big into like the tactility of writing things down. Like there's I've read it somewhere and it could be total bullshit, everything on the internet. But like your brain tends to remember things better if you handwrite it than type it. So I find that by handwriting things, either like on the whiteboard or on paper, it kind of puts it in my mind better and helps me more clearly understand what I'm doing. Or if I type things, a lot of the times I'll be typing on the computer, but I'll be thinking about Twitter or something other than the work at hand.
so your level designs you're drawing on paper?
Yeah, that's they're all probably going to start on paper. Like the one that I did for this little arena, it all started on paper. I had like 3 or 4 different sketches for it, and eventually I settled on one, and then I started porting that into the engine.
So let's say, are you going to have any non-linearity? So are you going to go back to areas you've been before with new items that can unlock things and stuff like that? Or are you going to go linear?
I think I'm gonna in the idea of staying true to the Sega kind of mindset. I'll probably be a more linear level based game, just because it'll probably be simpler for me to put together. Because it's still my first game technically, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Because I was going to say, this is one of the things that is really, I find really hard to manage with drawing out your level designs, your maps. If
Oh
you
yeah,
have, like, let's say a door in level 0 that's locked and you get something in level 6 and you come back to 0 to, a key, whatever the key may take its form as. But to actually draw out your levels and track all those different things, especially if you have multiple,
right.
and when you have like not difficulty gating so much, but like item gating, like let's look at like Zelda Link to the Past, like parts where you get the Titan's Mitt, where you can pick up these rocks like later on, how you map all those different items out, they can unlock different areas.
Yeah, it's
I found stuff like that really tough to manage, like the low level game design. That's why I
dude,
wanted to make this podcast.
that stuff is sorcery to me. Like I know I'm like super late to the party on this, but like my friends finally convinced me to play Dark Souls 1 like 3 weeks ago. And I was playing Dark Souls. I'm like, how in God's name did they make this map? It's like witchcraft. How everything just kind of loops back in on itself and you can just like go like you can just walk like it feels like you're going away from like the first area Firelink Shrine for like 3 hours and then you take an elevator and you're right back where you started. It's like how did that even
Yeah,
happen?
I felt the same way. And then I looked into the history. I mean, From Software, I played all the Armored Core games. They've been around forever, but they
Right.
pretty much made the Dark Souls game like 7 times before that one, through Demon Souls and all these other games that were a lot like it. So
Absolutely.
through practice, they just iterated on that design for so long. They're masters. So when we're noobs and we look at it, we're just like, oh my God, how do you do this? But it's just, yeah, I just like, well, Demon Souls 1 and 2 or 3 or however they made. And then there's like a first person weird one before that, but it's kind of the same kind of dungeon thing.
Yeah, Kingsfield, right? For the
Yeah.
PS1. Dude,
So,
if you want to have like your mind blown, there's somewhere online. I forget where it is. I can probably find the link somewhere. Someone ripped the entire Dark Souls map and uploaded it so you can just kind of look through it like in a 3D sort of turnaround
oh,
thing. The
wow.
entire map of Dark Souls, you can just like see it from like, you know, a god's eye view sort of thing. It was really cool.
Yeah, that's like, I mean, those are like the master's tricks. You have
Right?
to, yeah, have a certain experience level in game design, I imagine, to do that kind of stuff.
Definitely. It's goals
So,
though, dude. Hashtag goals.
because those are the things that like I've said on every episode so far, and that's one of the reasons I started this, because you look into game design and what's available in books and online, and there's a lot of high level stuff. You see stuff about game design documents, which is all this information that's done before anything is prototyped or made. And it's very high level, but the low level, like the grit, like the stuff I was talking about, how do you link that lock to that key in level 7? And how are you drawing your maps and tying it together? So one of the most useful things that I learned about through my friend Ash, who we're going to have on the show, is that Artisy Draft I was telling you about, the program I think we were talking about. And so
Yeah, yeah.
I post some screen caps of it in the podcast show notes or the off topic if anyone wants to look in the text channels, but that's helped a lot. But it doesn't seem like, because from the other things we've worked in, it's all like you can learn a workflow. Like you want to make an animation, okay, write a script, storyboard it, model your stuff. Like, there's this known workflow that's shared universally. But for games, I haven't really found that. Have you found anything like that?
No, I mean, one of the things I'm focusing on a lot right now is I'm trying to learn more about level design, learn more about that low level stuff. Because I mean, it's like the podcast is called. It's the nitty gritty stuff. It's what makes your game work. And the reason I didn't try and do anything more with levels in the vertical slice that I made, I just made a little arena. It was like, I'd rather have no level than a crappy level. I don't want to go in this and just kind of guess. I don't know what makes levels fun yet. I don't know how to make it all tied together behind the scenes. And it's just like this arcane wizardry that all the masters like FromSoft know that if it gets out, like their secret sauce is gone. So they got to keep it behind lock and key,
You know, I think something that's important too that you're doing is that you're doing it based on a Genesis game. So an older game before all this fancy, like crazy stuff came in with like roguelikes and blah, blah, blah in the design, because something I found really helpful, if anyone wants to check out on archive.org, they have all the Nintendo Power back issues. And the Nintendo Power issues like break down all the old Nintendo Entertainment System games. But from a designer's perspective, they're awesome because it's all the rooms, it's all the maps. It's like, here's the key, here's the lock. And, all the fancy stuff that has in today's games is stripped away. It's just the basics. And I found that really, really useful for level design to look at those and how they work and their basic mechanics.
Yeah, that sounds pretty rad. I'll definitely have to check that out.
Yeah, so I think maybe for us as beginners, we should be looking at the older games that were simpler, because they still have the same roots. It's just on top of it now is all these other layers of complexity with stuff that's going on. So
yeah, I mean, I think with older games, it's just because they're so much simpler, it's kind of easier to kind of peek behind the curtain because there's not so much obscuring it. It's just like a very simple, the technology is so simple that like the mechanics kind of shine through a lot more because they had to rely on those more. So they're kind of more upfront. There's not like super crazy cinematic, like lifelike visuals obscuring the fact that like, oh, you got to shimmy through this tunnel because it's an actual loading screen or things like that. It's a lot more, less obtuse, I suppose.
Yeah, the mechanics are just much more visible.
Yeah.
So as learners, we can go in there and learn from them. So thanks for being on, Tom. This has been an awesome episode. And is there any final things you want to leave with the other game developers or people who are going to jump into game development like you did? Something you would change, something you do different, anything like that?
I just don't wait 10 years like I did to start making games. Like I think the great thing now is like there's so many options technology wise that no matter what your skill level is, you can make games. Like I did a video on my YouTube channel a couple days ago said if you really love games, you should make one. Because making this game has taught me so much about not just like games from a creative standpoint, but as a player. Because one of the most interesting things for me about making this game is I had to really reverse engineer what I liked about games. Normally when you play a game, if you don't like it, you just throw it away. Mm-hmm. But 90% of the time the Azumi game was being built, it didn't play well and I didn't like it. So I couldn't just throw it away. It was my game. I had to sit down and figure out, okay, what do I like about games and why do I like it and how do I make that happier? And it was a really interesting experiment to kind of say, oh yeah, hit stop, never knew that was a thing, but that's like super imperative to like my enjoyment of games. Is like making hits feel super cathartic and like having the screen shake and having the flash when they get hit and having some hit stop, like all these little things that I never knew about that just reinforced my taste as a player and as a developer. It was really cool.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. I find I'm kind of the same way. Mine's with knockback, like knocking the enemies into stuff. But that's a super important point about, because what I found a bad thing I'm doing sometimes is I just start putting things in my game that I don't even like, but I'm like, I need to do this because it's a game. So I need to get back to like, yeah, I don't like that. So why should I have it? Right? It's our game. Like,
absolutely. I'm trying to make my favorite kind of game, and it's easy to kind of like put things in there, and like especially because like I got tons of comments on the Newgrounds upload. And there are tons of people saying, well, you should do this. The controls are like really floaty and they don't feel great. Other people would say the controls are perfect. You change it, I'll kill you. And just like I just gotta like keep my head down and like take all that with a grain of salt and make sure when it's done, like this, if I was 10 years old again and I had my Sega in front of me and I threw this cart in there, it would be my favorite game and I'd still have it with me to this day. So that's kind of the goal.
I think that's a super important point to leave with people. Like, yeah, make the game your 10-year-old self would be excited about.
Yeah.
Can't go wrong. So we'll post that link and the link to your YouTube and everything else in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go check out Tom's stuff, please do. And so thanks for being on the Game Dev Grid podcast. Hope to have you on again.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right.